Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Last episode, I discussed the background forces that continue to define relations between the United States and China. This included Xi's mention of Thucydides as threat, Taiwan, and China's expansion of its nuclear arsenal. Now that we've explored these background forces, we can begin to dive into the meeting from last week. What deals were formulated between the Americans and the Chinese, and what does this meeting in isolation mean for the United States and Chinese relations as we look forward? Firstly, I'm going to discuss the deals that were made during this meeting. The first deal that we saw was a deal for Boeing planes. This was a 200 plane deal, but this was less than the expected 500 planes. As a result, this actually saw Boeing stock fall on this announcement. Trump did say that in the future this deal could be raised to 750 planes. The second deal was in beef and soybeans. Trump told reporters on Air Force One that China had agreed to purchase, quote, billions of dollars of soybeans. Also, Reuters reported that China approved import license renewals for American beef. Moving on to energy and the situation in Iran, and the White House claimed that China expressed interest in purchasing more US oil to hedge its dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans and the Chinese also reportedly agreed that Iran couldn't be allowed to toll a global oceanway as it is currently attempting to in the Strait of Hormuz. The issue for China especially is that tolling global straits could set a precedent for other straits around the world, including the Strait of Malacca, that China is attempting to build alternatives to due to its reliance on the choke point for trade. The United States also said China agrees that Iran can't be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, but this wasn't stated in China's readout of the meeting. Finally, China agreed to help with the negotiations with Iran, despite Trump saying previously that he didn't need help. However, there are some issues here, specifically associated with the fact that there are some signs that China has been aiding Iran with the export of rocket fuel from Gaolan port in Zhuhai, and reports that some Chinese firms have been plotting secret arms sales to Iran. Another agreement that was made between the United States and China is the Board of Trade and the Board of Investment. The work of US and Chinese officials to reduce trade tensions prior to the APEC summit in 2025 did see China suspend a ban on exports of critical minerals to the United States. The suspension of this ban holds until November 2026, and at this time it's assumed that the deal will be revisited. As a result of this existing policy, during this meeting, there was no change in the rare earths trade between the two nations, but a board of trade was said to be established between the two nations. Also, an investment board was to be established for Chinese investment in non-sensitive sectors in the United States. Another area of potential cooperation between the United States and China is in AI safety. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that the United States is in the lead when it comes to AI, and that the two superpowers were going to set up a protocol about how to move forward safely. Much of this worry has been caused by Anthropic's Mythos model, which is supposed to have cyber capabilities. Finally, one deal that the Chinese did state came out of the meeting was the need for a vision for constructive strategic stability. Xi stated that this should be a pursuit for both sides, where stability with cooperation becomes the norm in relations between the two. Now that these deals have been stated, the question now becomes, where do we go from here? The agreements associated around energy and the Middle East are notable, but the area that I want to explore in more detail is artificial intelligence and semiconductors. Now, the first notable aspect of these deals is that many of the details emerged from the United States' side, apart from the vision for constructive strategic stability, which was promoted heavily by the Chinese. Chinese readouts of the meeting didn't provide any tangible details on the other agreements, and so some of these deals should be taken with a rather large grain of salt unless confirmed by the Chinese. In discussing semiconductors and artificial intelligence, some analysts expected key developments in these areas to occur during this meeting. In the aftermath of the meeting, some reports have implied that developments could have occurred in the background and that these haven't been disclosed publicly. Trump stated in the last few days that China is blocking NVIDIA H200 purchases, despite US approval being granted back in January 2026. More powerful chips, such as the newer Blackwell chips, remain under strict export controls from the United States to China. This is because the United States is typically seeking to keep China one generation behind when it comes to these advanced chips. But China is advancing rapidly in open source models such as DeepSeek and Alibaba's Qwen models. The Chinese also want to build their own chips and their own models, thus prioritizing resiliency that China possesses across multiple other realms of geopolitical competition with the United States. Before China does build this resiliency, the United States' advanced semiconductors and GPUs are an advantage that Trump should seek to leverage in the future meetings that are coming later this year. China's open source push is seeking to undermine US AI dominance, and it could do this by attracting European and Global South users. If we focus specifically on Europe, historically they have maintained close relations with the United States, but in our geopolitical world today, Trump is busy alienating his allies. The leaders Trump typically compliments the most in our world today are Xi, Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Lukashenko of Belarus, whereas he typically critiques Starmer, Macron, Petro, and the Pope, among many others. Could Trump's alienation of his allies see the Europeans grow more accepting of Chinese AI models and relations with China in general? This could see issues related to digital sovereignty and cyber surveillance arise for the Europeans, but it would also allow Europe to hedge against the United States' dominance. Also, if these Chinese models are cheaper and more accessible, they could gain adoption in general in comparison to US models. We've also discussed Europe's advantages when it comes to EUV lithography systems, exclusively created by ASML, coming out of the Netherlands. These systems are used to paint intricate circuit patterns onto silicon wafers. This issue and the position of Europe is an issue that is worth pondering more, because AI will be a key realm of competition, or perhaps conflict, between the United States and China. Also, this is a focus on AI in isolation, but if we take all of these realms of modern-day competition, this specific framing regarding the role of Europe can be expanded. Other nations around the world could expand trade with China to hedge against the United States. This is a trend that is already occurring. In decades past, the United States was the largest trade partner of many nations around the world that have now seen China grow to become their largest trade partner. In discussing trade with China, nations could also start to trade more with China using the renminbi or using the Shanghai Gold Exchange to swap renminbi or alternative currencies into gold. This could see nations slowly attempt to distance from the dollar and the power that this gives the United States. All of these potential trends show that Trump alienating his allies is already having huge global ramifications. In discussing the Chinese renminbi, there was no public discussion on the potential revaluation of the currency. However, with the rising use of the renminbi in global trade, it may be expected that the currency will naturally gain value. A cheaper renminbi is an issue for the United States because a cheaper currency encourages exports because it makes a country's goods and services less expensive for foreign buyers. This gives China a price advantage in international markets, which increases demand and export volumes. The United States has been unhappy with this for years, saying that China artificially devalues the renminbi to maintain this advantage. In the coming years, I would expect to see some shifts here. And so, to sum up this recent meeting, this summit was expected by some to contribute to more real change than what actually occurred in reality. Many of the deals could very easily be reversed, and there is a precedent for this. This has happened before when China backpedaled on the purchase of $200 billion in US goods and services from the previous Phase 1 trade deal that was established in January of 2020. The final worry in the aftermath of this meeting is that the two sides seemingly disagreed on what they agreed on. China seemed heavily focused on Taiwan, while the United States and Trump celebrated these reversible deals. As I stated last episode, the fact that the two sides are talking is good, but this meeting in isolation likely won't be deserving of its own chapter in the story of US China relations. However, with future meetings set for later this year, perhaps this chapter isn't yet over. In regard to these future meetings, Trump has stated that Xi will travel to Washington on September 24th, and it is expected that the two leaders will meet at the APEC summit in Shenzhen in November and the G20 in Miami in December. We now look forward to September and Xi's visit to Washington to see if any of these potential background developments become more public and if we see further developments in the deals and relations between the two superpowers in general. I've said for many years now that China can allow their advantages in trade and its possession of resources to naturally accrue in a world that is redrawing global trade. It's this strategic patience from the Chinese that would lead me to expect that China won't give much up that would hinder themselves in these future meetings, because ultimately they don't need to. Even with the next meeting in Washington, likely to favour Trump and the United States since it's happening in their own backyard, I continue to see China playing the long game and not agreeing to any deal that could see it lose the resiliency it has spent decades building. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.